Good afternoon and greetings from Duluth, Minnesota. I'm Alex Gutterman, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of the thoughts I've been having about psychosis in the context of our psychopathology class at Adler. So if we look at the DSM-5 on psychosis, we're going to hear about hallucinations, delusions, persistent delusions, particularly of a fantastic or bizarre nature, anhedonia, other negative symptoms, bodily apathy, asocial behavior, disconnection from society, and so forth. And before I talk about Adler's or the individual psychology approach, I'd like to briefly state that from a superficial standpoint, this DSM-5 account is not going to be something you're going to see a lot of disagreement about. People are going to use it as a labeling tool, regardless of the school they're from or the approach they take. So if we look, say, at the one approach to psychosis, given that it's a fairly extreme manifestation of what you might call mental illness, the biophysical approach will emphasize neurological dysfunction, brain dysfunction, and look to a medical, usually a medication response. Now, a closely related or potentially closely related theory of psychosis would refer to specific intense trauma over time, whether it's persistent developmental trauma or individual trauma events over time. Life stress is accumulating to the point where there's a breakdown in the nervous system. Again, there's a physiological breakdown that is more or less irreparable, leading to a whole bunch of cognitive and emotional effects that appear as psychosis and psychotic symptoms. Now, individual psychology sprang from psychoanalysis, and if we take three depth psychology or three psychoanalytic approaches, maybe Freud, Jung, and Melanie Klein, we can see that what the psychoanalytic account of psychosis has in common, regardless of the practitioner, is essentially the idea is that very powerful unconscious components break through under moments of stress or an inadequately developed ego or what have you. They break through into consciousness, but not in a temporary manner, or not as, say, a dream or a hallucination or a one-time event, but in a consistent and overpowering manner. These unconscious contents, which are distinct qualitatively from the normal ego consciousness, these elements break through and come to dominate consciousness. So, for in Melanie Klein's case, just to pick an example, you're going to have these very early structures, which she refers to as fantasy from the paranoid schizoid position. These structures, which are managed and maintained and overcome to a degree with effort by the ego structure, these structures again become dominant, leading to this very significant change in both inner experience and outward behavior. With Freud, you're going to see something very similar. You have repressed contents, id contents of the psyche. And for whatever reason, the ego structure is inadequate to contain these repressed contents, and it's not as though they're occasionally bubbling through, say, in a neurotic symptom or a dream or a slip of the tongue or what have you. They rupture the defenses to the degree that they swamp the ego and become this alternate reality becomes the dominant structure, as opposed to the ego and its somewhat more functional apparatus and worldview. And with Jung, you'll see the idea that there are archetypes and the very basal elements in the collective unconscious that again are functioning in quote primitive manner, and they come from this very early ontogenic development of the human civilization. And in psychosis, we will see again these elements breaking into consciousness and becoming the ruling factor within consciousness. So again, you've got you've got the definition of psychosis, which includes hallucinations, delusions, etc. Then we looked very, very briefly at a biological model that's just basically looking at the brain and the nervous system and not really functionality of the mental illness at all, and medication is offered. Trauma and how it might relate to the biomedical model. And then the psychoanalytic model, which we looked at Freud, Jung, and Melanie Klein, and the commonality there is that unconscious mental contents come to dominate consciousness. So when we look at individual psychology proposed by Alfred Adler in this context, what we need to emphasize as being distinct is the goal, a few things, but one is the goal-oriented and purposive teleological meaning of all mental symptoms. Adler proposed a unified theory of mental illness. Everyone that we'll find in the DSM-5, everybody, people who pull their hair, bulimics, alcoholics, pedophiles, the psychotics, they're all suffering from the same problem. Basically, what happens is that a person has inferiority feelings. It's part of being human. And we are continuously trying to create an inner arrangement, a cognitive schema or private logic or what have you, and an outer circumstances that overcome or mask or compensate for these inferiority feelings. And we are continuously engaged in this process of going from this felt minus, which is the inferiority feeling, to a perceived plus. Now, people who do this in a way that we consider mentally healthy are people who negotiate what Adler called the 3 life tasks with courage and flexibility and with interest in one another. The 3 life tasks are work, social life and friends, and love and sexual intimacy. So a mentally healthy person is someone who has adequate ability to cooperate and adequate love for others and adequate courage to face the imperfections and limitations of daily life to make some success and acceptable success in those 3 areas such that their cognitive schema that they've developed as on top of these inferiority feelings to a degree matches and is effective in interacting with this real world out there. So those are healthy people. Now, on the Adlerian scheme, everybody, no matter what, has a goal in mind. A goal in their cognitive schema, their private logic. It's what drives them. According to Adler, we are not driven by unconscious sexual desire. We're not driven by some sort of Jungian, New Agey desire to unify or integrate the consciousness. We have specific teleological goals that are private and personal to us based on how we developed and the picture of the world and of the ideals and of how we can protect ourselves from inferiority and defeat and failure. But the healthy people have goals and are driven and are teleologically oriented to realistic outcomes. Realistic outcomes like, hey, having a girlfriend or getting married, getting a job, getting a promotion, hanging out with your kids, writing a book, okay? And also the healthy people are able to endure and flexibly adapt to reality when they don't succeed. Unhealthy people, and this includes psychotics, have strong inferiority feelings, but they've constructed cognitive schema and strategies for dealing with the 3 life tasks that are mistaken, that are flawed, that do not match up in an important way with what makes people actually happy. Now, this can be minor or relatively harmless, or it can be very, very extreme. One important key split here would be between neurotics and psychotics. On the Adlerian scheme, what the neurotic people are doing is they are acknowledging and they see reality, they're aware of reality, and they live in the common social reality. But they have to make up hesitations, yes buts, excuses. They have to create a cognitive structure that excuses and in some way allows them to step aside from the demands of daily life because they're lacking in courage, they're lacking in encouragement. They have in some way been discouraged and they don't believe they can succeed in love, work, and sexuality and intimacy. So they have to create a world picture that gives them an excuse. So in the neurotics, you might find addicts, you might find people with OCD or anxiety problems, social anxiety. So all of those symptoms or setups provide that person on the individual psychology model with a reason why they don't have to fully enter into reality and deal with it the way we do, although they're aware of it. Now, the psychotic, one of the Adlerian positions is that the stronger the person's inferiority feelings, the greater the inferiority feelings, the greater the symptomatic compensation. Okay? So, in the case of the psychotic, according to Adler and his people, we have very, very strong inferiority feelings. Now, these strong inferiority feelings, coupled with potentially major trauma in life, developmental issues, a poor upbringing, and additionally biophysical components such as genetics, epigenetics, toxins in the environment. Because remember, Adler is a holist, so the physical and the developmental issues are relevant. He's just a soft determinist. In any case, all of these factors combined with these strong inferiority feelings, in the case of the psychotic, work in a holistic manner such that the psychotic's choice of symptomatology is not to create a series of excuses while remaining aware of the social obligations of the real world and pretending or partially honoring them. No, the psychotic essentially creates a cognitive schema that divorces him or herself as much as possible from the world, and in fact creates a new world, a world that is structured such that the psychotic does not need to feel or face his or her overwhelming feelings of inferiority. So what's different about Adler's approach and about individual psychology's approach is that on Adler's approach, when we encounter somebody who's been diagnosed as psychotic, we ask, in what way, shape, or form are his or her symptoms serving a goal? What is this goal? What is being protected? What inferiority feelings are being avoided? And lastly, and very, very importantly, how can we connect with this person to gradually encourage them to return to the commonly accepted social reality? One of the very interesting beliefs that the individual psychologists hold that is not held, say, in a biophysical model where schizophrenia or what have you are considered to be basically permanent medical conditions. One of these beliefs, one of the key beliefs that Adler holds, is that with adequate connection to another person and adequate encouragement, any so-called mental illness can be overcome. Now, if we have an organic brain illness that's literally caused by some, unfixable neurological condition, well, then we have a neurological condition. But on Adler's hypothesis, all mental disorders, if they're psychological, stem from a discouraged individual who cannot fully face or at least adequately face the major life tasks. Psychosis is an extreme example driven by extreme conditions and extreme feelings of inferiority, which have brought about an extreme solution on the part of the psychotic individual. But it's not a hopeless case if you are an Adlerian. I think that the last thing that there are 2 points that I would like to make here, 2 fundamental points. The first relates to the specific manifestation of the psychosis. Adler very, very casually dismissed, say, Jung. I mean, explicitly in his writings, he dismissed Jung's thoughts about the collective unconscious as being involved in psychosis. He was very dismissive and arrogant about it. And clearly also he dismisses the psychoanalytic propositions offered by Melanie Klein and Freud and so on. Now, I understand that on the Adlerian model, the teleological goals, the private logic, are essential. here, and there's a reason for taking less of a close look at some of the contributions of other theories. But in my opinion, it is actually interesting, first of all, interesting from an academic and theoretical standpoint, but also I think potentially relevant from a treatment or even connection and compassion standpoint, that we investigate, say, depth psychology or psychoanalytic models of psychosis. I think, for example, Melanie Klein's account of the way in which the consciousness develops, the way in which the unconscious interjects figures, the paranoid schizoid position, how that relates to the depressive position. Her work, in my opinion, is potentially germane to what one might call a sensitive or compassionate phenomenology of psychosis. And I think that a sensitive or compassionate phenomenology of psychosis can itself be part of a genuinely loving, respectful encounter with a psychotic person. And that moves me to my last point, which is that, one of the really amazing things about Adler's holism is that when you look at all the factors involved in one distinct, unique human individual, and you drop the diagnosis. I mean, except insofar as you use it, maybe to talk with colleagues or, for insurance claims or something. Because you've got all these spokes of the wheel, the spoke of family background, the spoke of dreams and early recollections, the spoke of ideals and goals, the spoke of the external environment, the spoke of any oppression or trauma the person has experienced, the scope of their wishes, their hopes, and their dreams, the scope of their food that they eat and their physical health. All of those spokes of the wheel allow us, when we approach an individual and connect, to feel around, feel. Where is the angle? What is the alley? What is the road on which I am going to connect with this person? And to believe that there is such a road. In other words, the holistic method, in my opinion, does not exclude even taking a psychoanalytic approach with a specific person if it were felt that that specific person was the type who would benefit from such an approach. There's so much more to say, but if I had to sum up what I think I've taken from this course most profoundly, is the unified theory of mental illness. Whether I agree with it or not, the power of its gathering, how it can gather everything under one umbrella. The humility. The doctor is not some phenomenal, Aristotelian catalog master who knows all these tiny little symptoms of this or that. We're talking about the same problem, the same human problem, which is facing reality, facing the life tasks. And when you talk about humility, just the kind of immense sense of one's own limitations when sitting in a room across from another complex individual human being. But I hope that this study would allow me to take a compassionate and thoughtful and connected approach to people that might be dismissed in other social contexts. Thanks very much. It's been a great course.